Okay, welcome back to the last question. You're in for a treat today, perhaps, especially if you don't have too much time. Because I don't have too much time either. I have to get back to work. It's middle of the day. Forgive me if you're watching on YouTube and you see the screen shaking a bit. I'm adjusting the camera and the computer, so it's not you. It's definitely me. Just trying to get things into focus because it's kind of weird looking at yourself while you're doing something like this, but that's the way this works. Um, 1 week into season 3 of The Last Question, the podcast is back. I wasn't lying before last week in last Monday's episode, which dropped right after Easter weekend. Wasn't lying that this was coming back, but of course, and thank you to those who reached out with various kind comments about being back in the podcast space. Of course, 1 week in, and I already missed what I had intended to be the weekly drop of Monday for various reasons, including some travel. Well outside of cell phone and internet signal range. And no, I definitely don't regret that, regardless of whatever deadlines I might have missed. But so recording this, in fact, as something of a live episode, if you will, not quite live because you're not going to be listening to it as I speak, but this will drop midweek. There were a couple of different paths I could have gone for this second episode. I'm really excited that next week's episode is an interview. I'm talking to a special guest. Every guest is special, right? That's what every show says, but a special guest for a number of reasons. One, he's an historian whose expertise, whose subject of expertise he's been cultivating for years, since childhood, in fact. You'll understand what that means when you listen to his story. But his expertise also, I think, is critically important to some of the discussions that we are having today in the U.S. and in the West. And I think that will become abundantly clear to you when you listen to it also. So it's an interview. It's not just listening to me ramble on for 20, 30, 40 minutes. It's going to be a wide-ranging conversation. We're booked for a couple of hours, and so I'm excited for that. And I would encourage you to consider watching it on YouTube, not because I'm trying to drum up my views, but because he's already planning on sharing various images and documents and things that he's looked at in his research over time and things that he shares with his class. He's a full-time community college professor, which is to say he teaches for a living, unlike many university professors I know. That's really not a knock on anybody in particular, although if you were a professor during my undergrad experience, chances are that describes you. But in any event, and that's only gotten worse with time. Anyway, really excited meeting. He's a friend of mine, a friend of the family's. I've known him for a long time because he was my history teacher once long ago when I was in high school. So I'll say enough there. There's a couple of you out there listening that when you listen to this episode this week, you'll probably know who I'm talking about. But for the rest of you, that'll be it for the teaser. And hopefully you tune in for season 3, episode 3 next week. This week, I feel particularly convicted by a couple of things. One is a reading, a passage from a book called Wounded by Love. So it's a book about Saint Porphyrios, who is a Greek saint, or a saint of the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Patriarch of Constantinople. His Holy Synod canonized Saint Porphyrios, I think, in 2013, November 2013. Saint Porphyrios died in 1991. So oftentimes you run into situations where you're reading the life of a saint. If you're a part of the Christian church and you're reading a life of a saint, it can be a great experience. It's great for your own development in your spiritual life, but it can be tough sometimes to relate to them because perhaps they're from the medieval period, or you're reading St. Paul, who's from the first century, apostle to the Gentiles, but it's difficult to understand the life he lived when you're living life in 21st century America, or 21st century anywhere really on the earth. St. Porphyrios lived in Europe, died in 1991. And if I remember correctly from the first half of this book, which talks about his life, and then I've also watched various lectures about him, he was a radio operator for the Greek military. As a Greek, As a native-born Greek, he owed service to the Greek military, like every Greek male, and like many males born across the world. He owed military service, was a radio operator, and in fact leans on that experience every so often when he's giving spiritual guidance to his spiritual children. Entered the monastery, the monastic life on Mount Athos, which to this day, to certainly the Orthodox world, but even to Catholics who are paying attention, is a holy place. It's an island in the Aegean, I think, with a serious concentration of monasteries. Only men can visit after there's a certain geographic point on the island where only men can pass through, because all of the monasteries are male communities. There's no female communities that I know of. Anyway, we're sort of getting off topic, but Wounded by Love, if you're watching on YouTube, you're going to see the cover of the book right here. You can find it on Amazon, $31, $32. Might sound a little bit expensive, but it's definitely worth it. The priest who recommended this book to me said, this is not a book that you read fast. And, I said, he said, read it slowly, a few pages at a time, maybe. You will need time. Do not rush through it. And I said, okay. But I tend to be one of those folks. Sometimes I'll get into a book and I don't necessarily mean to read fast, but then I'm like, well, as soon as I finish this, I can get to the next book. Right. I cannot read this book fast, even when I want to. The first half went relatively quickly because it's the story of his life. And it didn't go quickly because it was somehow uninteresting or simple. There was profundity even in the first half, but the second half is when you get to this man's writings. So the things that he talked about and said to his spiritual children. And there's places in this second half of the book, frankly, where I read a sentence or a paragraph and I cannot keep going because I can't get that paragraph out of my head. And so, to be honest, what I want to do today is talk about a couple of things. One, the source of one of my most recent convictions coming from this book, and then two, the source of the other conviction coming from a podcast I literally just listened to this morning. An interview with Senator Ben Sasse, former senator, former president of the University of Florida, Ben Sasse, who in December received a rather catastrophic terminal cancer diagnosis, but speaks in this interview like nobody else I've heard speak, who's living potentially the last few months of his life with a wife, with still one young child at home out of three. Anyway, like I said, I don't have too much time, so I'm going to dispense with some of the additional ramblings and get into this. So first, let me read you this. And like always, right, you're going to hear some theologically heavy language. Certainly, if you've listened to me or read me before, yes, I try to be a practicing Christian and churchgoer, but I fail at it just about every moment of the day. So I'm going to read this, but I would argue that there's something to take from this, even if you are a hardcore, there never can be a God type atheist. Even if you're one of those people, I think it would be interesting at least for you to listen to this and see what you think. So I was trying to find a couple of the passages earlier. There's a quote attributed to St. Porphyrios that talks about not fighting evil. And so if you're familiar at all with Christian Holy Scripture, you know that there's places where Jesus is recorded as saying, not only do you love your friends and your neighbors, that's pretty simple, that's pretty easy to do, but you love and pray for your enemies. You love and pray for those who persecute you. You do not strike back, but you in fact turn the other cheek. Those are two different passages, and the church, quote unquote, has engaged in 2 millennia worth of debate about what those passages mean and how we apply them in the case of domestic and international politics. Am I supposed to protect you more so than the foreigner who's in my neighborhood? Can I use what Jesus said that's recorded in the Gospels as justification for preemptive strikes against a potential enemy nation because they're threatening my neighbor? Right? That's 2,000 years worth of discussion that I'm engaged in, but we're not going to talk about today. What's interesting is that a man who lived through a world war, the Cold War, and in Greece, the Cold War was very real. There was a lot going on in Eastern Europe, and if you haven't read that history, certainly you're missing out. But Let me find the passage again. Okay, so this is a short paragraph, so forgive me. I'm going to just read this straight up from St. Porphyrios. It is a kind of self-projection of our own when we insist on other people becoming good. In reality, we wish to become good, but because we are unable to, we demand it of others and insist on this. And whereas all things are corrected through prayer, we often are distressed or become outraged and pass judgment on others. And then later on, the next page. So later on in this same chapter, which is on love for one's neighbor. Fanaticism has nothing to do with Christ. Be a true Christian. Then you won't leap to conclusions about anybody, but your love will cover all things. Even to a person of another religion, you will always act as a Christian. That is to say, you will show respect for him in a gracious manner, irrespective of his religion. You will care for a Muslim when he is in need, speak to him and keep company with him. There must be respect for the freedom of the other person. Just as Christ stands at the door and knocks and does not force an entry, but waits for the soul to accept him freely on its own, so we should stand in the same way in relation to every soul. So I could just keep on reading, but that'll take us off track and of course take a lot more time. Pope Leo, I think it was within the last couple of days, has been visiting Algeria. The president of the United States, the vice president have seen fit to criticize the Patriarch of Rome for comments he made. The patriarchs of the church are not political figures, but of course, do they speak to politicians and speak into politics? Of course, so did Jesus. But they aren't there to be political figures, elected or otherwise. But to the passages that I just read, so, and I am most assuredly guilty of this, particularly from my military time, but even thereafter and continuing to this day, to this moment. I'm recording this on a Tuesday. You'll get this episode dropped on Wednesday. I'm 2 days into a work week that I just want desperately to end. And it's because, in part, or perhaps completely, because I just want other people to be good, or to be serious, or to be consistent, maybe. But as St. Porphyrios has written, and as I've now had to read and reread 3 or 4 or 5 times, am I projecting my failure or my desire for goodness, consistency, honesty, ethical action, because I myself know that I am not good, consistent, ethically minded, moral in my dealings. It's very easy to justify ourselves, right? If you haven't committed murder, if you haven't stolen, if you haven't hurt or maimed somebody, right? Well, I'm a pretty good person. I'm not that bad. Well, what kinds of things do you think about? What do you think about other people? What do you say about other people when you're among friends or close family? How do you and your spouse talk about the folks who annoy you at work? I so desperately want people around me to be good. How much of that is taking focus away from how not good I still am? And I'm tempted to find it because I don't want to mess it up. So I'm going to try to find it. So I'm going to share a third quote, and this I actually saw before I read this book, but of course it's consistent, to be sure. A quote from St. Porphyrios. I don't have a date on it, but not a big deal. You don't become holy by fighting evil. Let evil be. Look towards Christ, and that will save you. What makes a person saintly is love. If there's one thing we're good at as Americans, and particularly these days, it's identifying groups of folks, if not individuals, to hate. And And I can't help but think that that extends to even the folks I complain about at home or at work, even the times when I'm engaged in rumors or gossip. Even if I'm talking about someone whom I don't overtly wish ill on or harm on, am I still harming them? I'm certainly harming myself, and I'm harming the reputation of someone else if I'm having a conversation without at least trying to understand this person's perspective, without at least trying to be charitable in my view. I am super frustrated by things. Am I just playing the victim at the end of the day? Like, is that really all I'm doing? Um, where am I? What am I doing? And I guess when I ask myself that question, then that's as good as any. That's as good a segue as any to the other convicting experience of this week, just from this morning. So, if you know who Russ Douthat is, New York Times contributing writer, an author, wrote a book recently about um, religion more broadly. I can't remember the name of the book offhand. That would be something I would do if I had prepared better for this, but of course, not a lot of time. What's the book called? I think it's called Believe. Yeah, Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Read it if you want. Don't read. I have not read the book. I've listened to him talk about the book in interviews. Not going to share my opinion on the book, but he interviewed former Senator Ben Sasse, who at the end of, I think in December of last year, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer that has metastasized to the point where he said, in his own words, he has 5 different types of cancers spread throughout his body. He's undergoing an experimental or a clinical trial, rather. The cancer volume has plummeted. His prognosis is certainly better than it was in December, when they thought he would have only 3 to 4 months to live, and he's at day 99, he said, as of that recording anyway. But just to listen to this man talk, a person who has had his mortality placed in finite terms, right? So we all on some level know, my wife and I joke about this line from, I think it's Frozen 2, we all will die. It's a line between, can't remember his name now to save my life. Doesn't matter. If you've seen the movie, I think you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's actually a really good movie, right? It's a Disney movie for kids. It's part of the Frozen franchise, but it is really good. In any event, we all know on some level that we're mortal. Why we're mortal, we could talk about in a different forum, right? We weren't designed to be or made to be mortal beings, and creation wasn't made to decay, and entropy wasn't originally part of the process, part of the system, but we brought that upon ourselves. In any case, we all will die. We all will leave this earthly life. But it's very easy to just pretend that's not a real thing, because we are so distracted by all the regular machinations of life, getting kids fed and off to school, trying to get enough sleep to not be a zombie at work, getting to work and realizing the best thing you can do is probably be a zombie because it doesn't matter. Going through all of these motions, trying to wrestle back some sliver of meaning, in spite of spending most of your waking hours working. We get distracted by all of that. And you know, the fact that I think about this for large swaths of every given day is likely a function of me entering my 40s, and so this is my midlife crisis. I wouldn't mind driving a Miata, like they seem like fun cars, but the midlife crisis I've entered into, I didn't buy a bike or a sports car. I really just got wrapped up about the fact that what I say I believe that's true about reality, I don't behave as though I believe it, and I just cannot get off of that X. And so then I listened to a guy like Ben Sasse, who's, what do you say, 54, married for 30 plus years, 3 kids, 2 of whom are grown and out of the house. So to a certain extent, right, that relieves some burden. He's not financially responsible for those 2. That helps a little bit, but he's got what did he say? I think a 14-year-old son still at home at a pivotal time in a young boy's life, right, where you want a strong father figure present in the house. Mom is there too, yes, but of course a 14-year-old boy is going to turn 15, 16, 17, deal with all the things that we deal with in that time period. It would be awesome for him to have his dad around. And that might still be true. It might still be the case. But this man talks about death. I think as a Christian is supposed to talk about death. But as he's talking about this and talking about the things he's learned, and then talking about what it means to have your mortality presented to you in such a way that you cannot escape it. You can't pretend 3 to 4 months to live, a quarter of a year remaining. He said he had some friends who presented him a birthday cake when he turned 54, and it said, "Happy last birthday, Ben." And his sense of humor, his demeanor, if you were just listening and it didn't start with the story of his diagnosis, you wouldn't be able to tell that he had terminal cancer. But then again, would he sound the way he did if he didn't have terminal cancer? I don't know. I think he would say no. He cited Timothy Keller at one point, Presbyterian pastor, longtime pastor of a church in New York City, in the middle of Manhattan, who contracted pancreatic cancer, went through treatments, has a wife, big family, rather famous Christian pastor who somehow managed not to get caught up in some of the standard scandals that some of the others have. And he said at one point, he said, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. It's painful. It's difficult. We should never laugh at or shirk the seriousness of death. However, Keller said, he also wouldn't trade the prayer that has come with this process for anything. He wouldn't go back to the way life was, because there's something about a terminal diagnosis that focuses you in a way that almost nothing else does. Now, this is not me leading up to some announcement or something that says I have a terminal that's an illness. That's not what's happening here. My worry, though, my concern is I am certainly still squarely in I think I'm basically healthy. I'm in my 40s. I've gained some weight in awkward places, but I still, can run outside without just totally collapsing. Things are fine. Kids are fine, got a house, and God has blessed me with way more than I would ever deserve. But am I doing with it and doing with what gifts he's giving me what I'm supposed to be doing now? Or by definition, are we all plagued with the tendency to just waste our lives until or unless we receive a terminal diagnosis early, quote unquote? If you're on video, I'll put the quotes overtly on the screen. A 54-year-old like Ben Sasse would have tons of time left to do great things for the world and with his family and to travel and to teach. And he's an historian by training, which I didn't know. He was an academic before getting into politics. He'd have plenty more time to do things. Excuse me, but will he make the impact would he have made an impact, or the impact that he will make, had he not received a terminal cancer diagnosis? There's a reason for everything. Certainly, as somebody who believes God is in control, and Sasse witnesses to this same reality, his call to die in the manner in which we think he will die means something, even if us mortals can't understand it. But I can't help but wonder every time I listen to a story like this, and his is particularly convicting to me, but his is far from the only type of story or the only example of this type of story. Does it take a terminal cancer diagnosis or some sort of existential, like legitimately existential crisis for me to stop wasting so much time, first and foremost, away from my wife and children, away from people who would arguably be most important to me in a pre-digital environment, right? My family, my cousins, friends. I have plenty of those people in my life, but do I pay attention to them? Hardly at all, because I'm focused on my job in cubicle space. And at the moment, as a side note, I'm focused on trying to keep people on my team from being laid off forcibly from under me, because my leadership and I do not in any way agree on just about anything. But that's me complaining again. And that's me, to go back to St. Porphyrios, wanting other people to be good in lieu of me. Because I can't. I know I can't. And I certainly on my own cannot. But am I trusting in him, in not St. Porphyrios, but in God? Am I trusting in him enough to not only acknowledge I can't be good by myself, but to allow him to make me good. And by that, forcing me to focus on what's important and to make difficult choices. I know I'm not doing it well, but I don't know what that means that I should do. So, certainly this also isn't going to be a solution for your life type of show. I'm just trying to, the goal is to share with you these quotes and perhaps get you to ask the same question that I'm asking, which is, are you, is the only thing that's going to get you to actually do what you think is important, or at least act in a way that's consistent with your values, is the only thing that's going to get you there to receive a terminal cancer diagnosis or something similarly threatening? I certainly, your family and friends would hope not. I know my family and friends would hope not, but what am I doing? Um, every time I get angry, I rationalize that by thinking I'm fighting evil. I'm fighting for better. Back in the day, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, this podcast was founded on the idea that we would, teach people better leadership because we need better leaders because our leaders in corporate space, in the military, and the government, they all suck. Yeah, I've worked for some pretty bad leaders, but I've also been a pretty bad leader. Like, I think I'm a pretty bad leader right now. I'm making a lot of mistakes right now. And it's not to say we won't keep making mistakes throughout life, but what's the point of me doing what I'm doing or making those mistakes if I'm not working towards something? Like, am I just keeping myself a cog in the machine because that's what's safe, or because that's what feels comfortable, or because I actually believe in it? Am I just afraid? But in the meantime, does that fear then keep me from trusting in something beyond myself that could make me better? And so instead, because I know deep down that I'm too scared, I'm self-projecting that desire for goodness on others. And so when the others don't meet a standard that they don't even know exists, that I'm exerting upon them, I'm imposing upon them, then I get upset. And that cycle just progresses, or persists. I'll keep living that cycle for another couple of decades, 3 decades, God knows however long, until I retire. And then finally I can live life and I'll be in my 70s, back busted, knee braces, won't be able to do shit by myself outside. Can't lift my grandchildren if my kids have kids, right? Like, and I'm just going to be another one of those people who succumbed on his own to pressures that he didn't have to succumb to from the world. We do not become holy by fighting evil. If anything, we probably become evil when we intend to fight evil. Even if the fight is just, even if you could argue objectively the fight is just, who are you to judge justice? That doesn't mean we surrender our morals and ethics at the doorway or at the shoreline. It doesn't mean we don't support our family members and friends and our kids when things go wrong and we try to fix them. We need to live our lives in such a way that we are still trying to live by an ethical and moral standard. And so we need to teach our kids these things, and we need to help our friends through these things. And if our friends are doing something damaging to themselves, certainly we want to step in and help. But in the grandest scheme, if I am not the source of justice, then who am I ever to judge what is just? And if I can't, just about the only thing I can know as a conscious moral agent is my own consciousness and my own thoughts and my own failings. And then at that point, the only thing that I can know is how unjust I am and have been. So what good is it me projecting my desires for better behavior on others when I can't even meet that standard myself? And then what do I do about it? I've been quite taken with this book and with the words of St. Porphyrios. I continue to read this book. I'm not quite finished with it. And like I said, it takes a while because you read a paragraph, a page, and you have to meditate on it for days, if not weeks. And so, yeah, but former Senator Sass and St. Porphyrios together are really making me ask some of these questions that I can't get away from. And for those of you, you might say, just, well, this is idle navel gazing. Like, get off your ass and get back to work and go do something for society. I'm not. I don't want to be lazy and do nothing, but I'm not sure what I'm doing for society right now is what I should be doing for society. If it is, perhaps, God will make that obvious to me, but I'm not sure that it is. And even if what I'm doing is contributing to society, is what I'm doing part of the path to doing all that I can to be the proper husband and father to my family, who are certainly the folks closest to me who also need the most from me, whether they expect it or not. I think they do, but of course they're not going to, my wife's not going to want to put undue pressure on me or, try to, she may not ever say it, but I would expect that she would expect a lot from me. And I know I'm not meeting those expectations, but it's certainly more important for me and for my children to be the husband and father I should be versus the cubicle dwelling middle manager that I am. But just look at the calendar and look at the clock and consider the proportion of time I spend doing the cubicle dwelling thing versus the husband and father thing. I can't remember who said it, but show me your calendar and I'll show you your priorities. That's part of what I'm talking about. And then I come home after the 8 or 10 hours a day focused on that, regardless of where I am, and then just get angry because I'm quote unquote fighting evil. There's many layers of this fighting evil idea manifest in my job. But if it's true, you don't become holy by fighting evil, then what am I fighting and why am I fighting it? Maybe if I would focus on fighting what's inside me that's still evil, that's still dark, that still needs help, maybe that would actually go a much longer way. So I'm going to leave it there because I have to get going, and perhaps so do you. If not, the next episode will be out next week because we're doing the interview tomorrow, and it's going to be a great conversation. But as you know, or if you don't, I'll tell you again, this is a one-man show, literally and figuratively. So I don't do much editing. Any editing really. There's not a whole lot of polish to this. What's important are the people, the stories, the conversations. It's not going to look fancy. But hopefully that's not all that you're looking for. If it is, you can go on YouTube or Spotify or any of the platforms and find all the fancy, well done stuff by all the media, the big media names. I'm here for the stories, for the people, and to figure out what we all really should be doing and spending our time on. So appreciate you listening. Appreciate you watching. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to try to do the video thing a lot more often, especially for folks like my guest next week who has things to share in the visual space. It's always more engaging probably when it's visual, but I'm one of those people too who appreciates being able to listen to the audio only version because I'm always moving around, running around, and I can get into these kinds of stories much more easily if I'm listening. Although perhaps that's another mode of distraction that I need to watch out for. Who knows? But this is the last question, season 3, episode 2. Episode 3 will be out next week. And yeah, that's all I've got. So we'll talk to you again soon enough. Otherwise, be safe. May God bless and keep you and your family. Stay healthy. Take care.